Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, I guess. We have a global audience. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all, and especially our two speakers today, to this conversation on cities on the front lines of the energy transition in the context of the sixth annual Atlantic Council Central and Eastern European Energy Security Conference. My name is David Korani, and I have the privilege to greet you in a triple-headed capacity as the senior advisor to the mayor of Budapest on city diplomacy, as a policy advisor on sustainable energy at UN DESA, and last but not least, as an Atlantic Council senior fellow and a former full-time employee of the council. And as many of you watching might know, I was very heavily involved in the organization of this conference back in the days. And it's great to see that this tradition is still well and alive, and I congratulate to Randy and the team for making this happen. Again, I understand that last year, because of the pandemic, you had to skip one, but the resumption is more than welcome. I was very encouraged by the fact that for the first time in the history of this conference, we decided to dedicate a panel to cities. And that's historic for a number of reasons, although of course national governments are typically seen as the main bodies responsible for governing energy supply and infrastructure and for driving the transition to renewable-based energy systems. City governments, in fact, are really uniquely positioned to curb energy use and the related greenhouse gas emissions, and will also accelerate the uptake of renewables. And of course, cities account for 3/4 of global final energy consumption and a similar share, or close to a similar share, of global related CO2 emissions. And they are home to globally 55% of the global population. And of course, that's a rate that's growing. And in our region in question today, Central and Eastern Europe, that urbanization rate is actually closer to 75%. So actions by city governments are really essential in the electricity sector, of course, but also in heating, cooling, and transportation. And cities are increasingly emerging as policymakers, target setters, regulators, and facilitators and advocates for renewables. And they are indeed implementing ambitious action plans to advance renewable energy, energy efficiency. And by extension, that also contributes to energy security by relying more on indigenous supplies. So it's very relevant in this context, or in the context of this conversation. And last but not least, we have seen cities being very active in the climate and energy space globally through organizations like C40, but also regionally within Europe. And this is something that Budapest has been spearheading for the last year and a half, a conversation on the European level, elevating the role of cities, building an alliance of metropolises and other cities, wanting to take a much larger responsibility in making sure that the European Green Deal is implemented, and then also trying to acquire the corresponding resources from European funds, both as far as the 7-year budget is concerned, and also the recovery and resilience facility. So really, rather simply put, there is no energy security and energy policy conversation without cities. And I'm very pleased to be joined by two excellent speakers today. Lolita Jackson is the Special Advisor on Climate Policy and Programs at the New York City's Mayor's Office. And Oda Amon, my colleague in Budapest, is the Chief Advisor to the Mayor of Budapest on Climate Affairs and the head of the Climate and Environment Unit of the City Hall. So welcome to you. And this is a truly transatlantic conversation, having two key cities on the two sides of the Atlantic. So let me first turn to Lolita and ask you about, during the Trump administration, you have seen cities really mobilize, and also states, and stepping into the void because of the withdrawal of the Trump administration from the Paris Agreement. How do you see the role of cities in shaping federal energy policy and local energy policies now, and how active you think cities are, and to what extent you see cities in this transatlantic energy dialogue space active? Over to you.
Thank you. So first, I had that job that you just said for quite some time. I just left about 2 months ago. So I did want to be clear with folks that I do work for the private sector now. I'm the city's person for a private equity firm that invests in the climate space, but I was the climate diplomat for New York City for 6 years, and actually very interesting time because the Trump administration was not doing any action on climate. And so, as you can imagine, during that timing in the United States, the U.S. cities particularly strengthened and heightened their actions on climate in the absence of the federal government. And there are networks that you mentioned, including some others that are U.S. specific, such as Climate Mayors and We Are Still In, as well as, of course, C40. We're very active. We are a very active part of that, as well as the Under 2 Coalition, which is international. Other key groups stepped in and stepped up their activities in a major way as well. But the Biden administration will not reach its climate goals unless the cities are involved in solving them as well. 25% of all emissions come just from the urban areas in the cities. And there's probably even a higher number in particular subsectors. So as one example, 40% of emissions are in buildings, and most of those buildings are in cities. In New York City, 70% of the emissions are from buildings because most people don't drive, so it's not transportation. We have 1 million school children in New York City. That's larger than some of the countries that we're dealing with when we're talking about COP26. 1 million school children, 400,000 people living in public housing, 44,000 police officers. So there's a lot of infrastructure owned by the city itself that needs to be retrofitted and needs to be made more efficient. It's critical that the activities that cities have been undertaking in implementing their climate action plans be fully considered by the federal government. There have been a number of calls for an Office of Subnational Diplomacy in the U.S. State Department to facilitate this activity, because the NDC that the NDC that the United States comes up with really needs to be rolling up those contributions that these cities have been doing. California, as a state, for example, has the 5th largest economy in the world. Their economy is larger than that of the UK. So the U.S., New York City, even our economy would be the 10th in the world if we were a country. So these are really sort of large players and actors that need to be considered. And I am aware that the climate envoy, John Kerry, as well as the domestic climate czar, Gina McCarthy, know about the importance of engaging with cities. When the administration first came in, there were many Zoom calls with cities in the first months, but more of that needs to be taking place, with those on the federal level listening as much as they're talking. Cities have been connecting with one another as well as bi and trilaterally for a long time, and it's now time for the federal level to effectively tap into what's already been happening and not try to change it or reframe it. That's my response.
Thank you, Lolita. A follow-up question, if I may. So while we're still at the mayor's office, I imagine you have been in quite close contacts with other cities across the US. Have you been having discussions with European cities at that point, or it was largely focused on global megacities and American cities?
No, absolutely. So we have relationships with through some of the networks, obviously Paris and London, but even smaller cities will connect with us. Many cities, particularly in the Nordic countries, are very active in climate. Even though they're small cities, they pack a powerful punch. The country of Norway decided to divest its sovereign wealth fund from fossil fuels, but they make most of their money from oil, which we found interesting. So we did a lot of work with them talking through how they were doing that as an example to other countries and other cities is one example. So Oslo, Copenhagen, Berlin, some other of the smaller cities as well. These networks are very strong. So you can be a smaller city and still be able to be very active and pack a powerful punch. So absolutely, we did deal with many cities across the world. And being New York, everybody wanted to talk to us. So I really did get the full breadth of interactivity with African cities and other cities as well.
Mm-hmm. Would you think it would be a good idea, because there has been this structured dialogue between the European Union and the US on energy that was by the wayside in the last couple of years, and now there is discussions about resuscitating it. Would you think that a cities component in that, so that cities from both sides of the Atlantic could also participate in those transatlantic EU-US energy specific discussions, would be helpful?
Absolutely, because I feel that a lot of the European cities and European companies are far ahead on some of the climate actions they've had. We have 7 wind turbines that are offshore, 7 in the entire United States, because there were so many people who did not want to see them from their homes. They protested with the fishermen, and I'm not denigrating that, but I'm saying there were a lot of roadblocks to getting any of that done. So 7 wind turbines off the coast of Rhode Island, that's it. And so you look at Europe, just that part alone, forgetting everything else that Europe has done ahead of us. Scotland's 100% renewable energy right now, how they get their power. We're nowhere near that. I don't know when we'll get there. I know we have goals to get there, but we need to be learning from what the Europeans are doing and have done to get there faster. So I absolutely think that cities want to see and be part of getting that information done, because cities are, as Ada will say, cities are where things get done. Cities do. countries talk, cities actually do, because they have their constituents in their faces saying, why is my garbage not getting picked up? Why are you not recycling everything? What are you doing? And so when you have to go to the grocery store and face that constituent, is very different than sitting in the palace or in the Capitol and hearing that. So for us, cities have to be involved, because that's how you're going to solve it. That's how I feel.
That's a perfect segue to Ada. So the Visegrad 4 has not always been at the forefront of bold climate action, although at least at the rhetorical level that appears to be changing, which is a welcome development. But then, as Lolita suggested, cities are really stepping up to the plate, and Budapest just adopted at the end of March a new and ambitious climate strategy. So if you could just walk us through very briefly on what that strategy entails, and how does that fit into or compared to the ambition levels and policies of the national government. And then if you could also briefly talk about how do cities fit into the European Green Deal, and what support mechanisms are or will be or should be in place for cities to get the necessary help in the green transformation.
Yeah, thank you, David. Well, basically, we have a quite long-term strategy, but obviously we had to break it down to smaller bites. And the overall strategy is to become a climate neutral city by 2050 and cut back emission by 40% by 2030. And obviously, as Lolita said, most of the emission from in the city is coming from buildings. So 2/3 of the CO2 emission is coming from different buildings, and the vast majority of it is coming from residential buildings. So obviously the major share of emission should be cut at the residence side, which is a very difficult thing, because usually municipalities and cities don't have duties on that field. And obviously, if we want to cut back emissions on that field, then we have to offer a major subsidy or grant money for people to touch their buildings and their building envelopes and insulate it and refurbish or replace the heating systems and the cooling systems at the same time. So it would obviously need a huge amount of money. And just to give you the feeling of it, our 10-year strategy would need about $9 billion to do all the things, which also includes adaptation and resilience measures as well. And this amount of money is 6 times of the annual budget of the whole municipality, which kind of give you a magnitude of order what type of sourcing would be needed in order to achieve that goal. And for that, we would obviously try to have EU sources, which is an obvious source for climate goals, which is part of the EU's main ambition at the moment, also in terms of cohesion money spending or the newly established recovery facility, which is aiming to recover from the COVID times. But most of this funding is somehow under the coordination and control of the government, which makes it very difficult to obtain any funding for these sources, as there is a political debate between the city leadership and the country government and the national government, which makes it very difficult to draw money into climate issues and climate goals from our side. Although we were obviously trying to reach out to the government, to the state secretary and to higher level of the government to make sure that we have a smooth cooperation and consultation and cooperation and coordination of the spending of the money. At least 20% of the Hungarians are living in the capital, which is quite the same in other Visegrad 4 countries, and obviously it would be a reason to have a substantial amount of money to develop the city, which has been neglecting climate issues in the past 30 years. But now it's time to do our job on this side. So yeah, this is I wouldn't really go into detail of in what type of action we would do this, and obviously buildings and transportation would require a huge amount of money to be invested in order to have this happen. But I think largely this is the idea of what we are trying to achieve. Obviously, the public consultation was a major part of it, as the city leadership is very eager to involve public into the major policy debates in the city. Not just major policy debates, but also local issues are consulted with the local stakeholders, and we are trying to make it happen as much as we can. So this is from my side, and yeah.
Can I have a quick follow-up question or two, actually? So one of the conversations that is taking place at the EU is the potential of opening up the Connecting Europe facility, which traditionally has been for infrastructure in the whole of Europe and Central and Eastern Europe in particular, and this whole notion of building up the North-South corridor, the 3 Seas initiative, that fits quite well into that. But so far we have been focusing more on gas pipelines for all the right reasons, for all the energy security concerns that the region had. But now there is this notion that, you know, relying on more indigenous renewables and building up charging infrastructure and projects like that, that would by extension take place in cities, would also fit into that logic. So now there is a discussion on having the ability to tap into Connecting Europe facility resources. So that's one way forward, I assume, if you agree. And then the question, to be more specific, there is the 3 Seas initiative, and it has a fund as well, which focuses also more on not just energy infrastructure, but beyond that as well. Would you think it would be a good idea to also open it up for cities or city projects that could fit into that?
No question. It's obviously a very important issue, and if we are to talk about energy security or security of supply, it is naturally defined by national level, but security of supply and energy security can be also defined and how to say, defined on city level. And what I'm mostly focusing on at the moment is how to integrate renewables in large scale into the city infrastructure, which can also serve electromobility services and electromobility usage and supplies, which would be a very important part of really keeping the city more or less independent in the future from other part of the country, as the peaking power demand is really happening in these big cities, and supplying electromobility and supplying mobility from this source, and keeping the generated power mostly within the city in order to supply the demand occurring actually mostly here.
And thank you, Nada. Let me turn back to Lolita. We have a little bit more than 6 minutes left, and I believe we should still leave a little bit of time for questions if they come in. I haven't seen any so far, but that may be just a technological issue. Lolita, city networks such as C40, New York is an active member, and Warsaw from the region is also active, and Budapest is aspiring to join, hopefully soon. They are very efficient in making city-level efforts more visible on the global stage, and also increasing ambition levels and exchanging best practices and providing technical support. So how do you see the role of cities and city networks in the context of the UN climate talks at COP26, in particular this year, and how can governments more explicitly recognize you made a reference to this already, the NDCs, like how can governments be a little bit more explicit in, as devising their NDCs and submitting their NDCs, be more closely in consultation with cities and reflecting cities' ambitions and plans in their NDCs as well?
I appreciate this question because my last job with the city, I was one of the very few people in the world that my entire job was climate diplomacy. So literally I dealt with every climate network, every city regarding climate. So I saw this from the ground level in ways that others had not. And first, let me say that New York City is an example like Tokyo and other cities where many of the largest mega cities are bigger than countries. New York City, as I said before, is the 10th largest economy in the world with $100 billion annual budget for New York City, forget the state. Is larger than many Nordic countries for sure. So it's critical that cities are considered when discussing global climate goals. In my past role, I was very active in C40, and I can tell you it's one of the most effective organizations to stimulate worldwide action, and not just climate, because they had mayors meeting from around the world on COVID. At least 30 to 40 mayors would get on these calls, and it was mayor to mayor. It was not their staff. It's amazing how they were able to do that. The Global Green New Deal, as well as the Green Recovery Principles that everyone has been talking about, are shared with cities around the world. So even the cities that may be a bit smaller or may not have as many resources, they talk with one another all the time about how to get that work done. Every city in C40 had to put together a climate action plan, or where they were going to get kicked out. And one or two cities actually were asked to get the plan together or leave. And almost all committed to net zero, usually ahead of their national governments. The Race to Zero is an initiative that's trying to get 1,000 global cities of all sizes and all continents to sign up to reach net zero by 2050. That's going to be announced, that list of cities at COP26. So that's one way where a lot of activity is going to be shown in the city space. In the context of COP26, while the cities are not at the negotiating table, it's clear that the UN recognizes that action is taking place far faster in cities, and there will be cities and regions activities during the conference. I'm actually helping to plan a particular event for cities, states, and regions that's high profile and will solely be for them. I just spent time in California, which is the 5th largest economy in the world, which is bigger than the economy of the UK, just that one state, last week. And many of their leading elected officials are planning to attend COP26. They're eager to go. They want to be with their compatriots. And actually, Scotland has an MOU with the state of California. So there's a specific reason they want to engage. And it is important, in other words, just to seize the moment and make subnationals be heard. I'm personally concerned that the climate actions of subnational governments will not be properly rolled into the NDC for New York City, for the United States in particular. When they announced what they thought the number was going to be, I was like, well, have they even talked to any of the cities? Because we're most of the emissions. And I look forward to seeing what happens between now and November in the US in particular to get there. last point I'll make is that the head of building energy efficiency for the Biden administration used to be the head of sustainability for New York City. And there are other key roles like that filled by former city and state officials in the Biden administration climate team. So I am hopeful that this will be fully considered. And I think you will find that the climate goals and the things that cities can do will start to be integrated more, at least on the US side. But I worry about other places. And there's one phenomenon I'll just point out to. If you have particularly the largest city in the country is led by an opposition leader, let's say the president is somebody who's one party, the person who's the large city is another party, they're not going to want to highlight that city. So my worry also that you have situations in COP26 where the cities that are like actually leading in climate may not be highlighted by their own countries. I can go on about this because I actually did a paper on it, but that's one point that I wanted to flag for people, that particularly if you look at like the city of Houston versus the governor of Texas, it's like that situation, but on the national level, that might also impede some of the discussions about cities getting their just due.
Ada, you want to react to that very briefly? Also bearing in mind that our boss, the mayor, is also running for Prime Minister of Hungary.
Oh.
Probably I leave it there.
I did not know that, so that's not why I mentioned it. So sorry,
No.
but it's just something I noticed with some other cities when I was doing that paper, actually. But yes, I mean but my point is that is common. So COP26 may be an interesting spot where you might have the cities getting together, but it might not translate when you get to that next level up.
So, and this is the perfect ending to a brief but very informative and rich conversation. Thank you, Lolita. Thank you, Ada, for your great contributions. And let me again thank the Atlantic Council, Ambassador Morningstar, the chairman of the Global Energy Center, Andy Bell, the director, Reed, Olga, the whole team for putting this on. And thank you all for tuning in. And we are really hoping that it was a good conversation so that next year we're going to have another panel on cities, and we keep seeing the emerging role of cities in this space as well. Have a great rest of the afternoon.